practice in your individual role. Is everybody seeing my first slide there? Affirmative. Let me see. Yes, wonderful. Okay. So just jumping in, I wanted to just give you a little bit more information about my own positionality as I approach this work. So I am a practitioner of higher education. I'm a director of assessment and accreditation at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas. And so we are a small private Catholic liberal arts institution. Just, a couple years ago celebrated our 125th year in our community. I also serve in a great organization called Texahia, the Texas Association for Higher Ed Assessment. All of us higher ed assessment misfits come together and kind of are able to be in community and share with each other. So that's the practitioner side. But I'm also a PhD student and a scholar. So I have a background in sociology. So before I ever knew I wanted to work in the education or the higher education space, I knew that I was very committed to equity and social justice and how identity influences how we move through the world, including how we get an education, how we learn different concepts. And so really approach my role in higher ed administration, right? But from that kind of lens of being very critical about society, about systems and institutions. So I got my master's in sociology, but I'm working on my PhD in educational leadership and policy studies at UTSA. I chose the program because it was an in-person PhD program. There's a lot of EDDs online that are offered to folks like me, but I went with this one because it was in person, and then the pandemic happened. So I started my doctoral work in fall 2020. So obviously all of the classes were offered online. I've never stepped foot on campus except one time for a quick administrative visit. So honestly, I never imagined myself being an online learner. I loved kind of that touchy-feely community aspect of my master's experience, but I really could not imagine my doctoral work any other way now that it's been online this whole time. And so where I'm at is essentially preparing for dissertation proposal this summer. And so this is kind of where I'm at so far. We, I think, are all kind of on the same page in terms of some of the dominant elements, ways that assessment has really reinforced a meritocracy in the United States, right? And so some of those elements of assessment look like an over-reliance on, standardized measures. And a lot of the literature up until very, very recently has come from studies of predominantly white students in mostly white institutions, right? So that is kind of one of the elements. That's our reality here in the US. Another are that certain demonstrations of learning are valued over others. I don't think that's news for anyone on this call either. But I do want to speak a bit about the role of accrediting bodies within that element, right? Because, part of my role is maintaining our accreditation through our SAC-COC, Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. That's our institutional accreditor, the big one, right? And so we just went through a 10-year reaffirmation process that I led. And I got just a lot of insight in how the accrediting body can be the tail that wags the dog, right? And we have these folks on these peer review committees, and we have the standards in place that obviously position quantitative, standardized, easy to follow, easy to kind of see like, oh, that tracks, yeah, that aligns, and kind of an over-reliance on, again, those assessment methods that are aligned with the meritocracy of standardized tests, et cetera, right? And so I think accreditation agencies play a role in these elements as well. And very similarly, that narrative or personal experience is not valued in the same way from an institutional decision-making perspective, then, you know, not as valued as like the quantitative institutional research, right? So we're not always, as institutions administratively, making decisions based on student experiences. And finally, students are not always considered experts of their own experience. We continue to perpetuate kind of neoliberalism within American higher education, where we are the providers of education as a service. Students are customers to be satisfied, right? So we are now seeing kind of this divergence within this area where, and I will be the first one to say the US is a little behind the curve compared to many colleagues around the world when it comes to engaging students in continuous improvement processes and, you know, just making assessment more equitable in general. So 3 terms I want to quickly just show you kind of how I'm conceptualizing these different terms. Equitable assessment. So these 2 researchers are some of my heroes. I actually got to meet them in person at the Assessment Institute this year in Indianapolis. But yeah, essentially, you know, equitable assessment takes a critical look at these assessment processes and how they can be a tool for equity instead of something that reinforces this kind of meritocracy model, standardized tests, et cetera, as predictors of student success, right? Like the SAT and the ACT, different kind of entrance exams, the GRE, et cetera. And instead looks to see how can this be a tool for us to get better, whether that's in the mastery of different subject matters or, you know, continuous improvement of administrative services, et cetera. Really what it gets at is the need to involve students in these processes. Students as partners, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is this process where students and groups of faculty or staff come together and contribute on whatever kind of project, right? So I'm going to present kind of what I'm thinking for my institution, but, you know, we've seen these groups come together to create new academic or educational programs, to redo assessment projects, to look at rubrics, to look at curriculum maps, you know, applied to assessment and applied out of assessment, right? But really the crux here is that students and then these faculty and staff groups work not necessarily in the same ways, but that they're able to contribute equally, right? So instead, it's not, students as partners wouldn't be exemplified by like a board of trustees having a student representative, for example. That's one student meant to represent all of the student body, right? That's maybe, you know, it's not as, I think, collaborative as students as partners, right? So that's not students as partners. It's more of an involved kind of co-creation process. And finally, this sense of student belonging I'm going to mention. I think many of us are very familiar with this definition, but I want to look at how students as partners interacts with student belonging. And so I'm looking at this definition here, right? Student sense of being accepted, valued, and included, encouraged in and out of the class. Okay, so now that I've got all of that out of the way, I want to kind of jump into what I'm thinking for this project. So in higher education, we have a lot of calls to action, right? We, especially after the pandemic, and at least at my institution, and I will say this is even more true for institutions like mine, small, private, liberal arts, right? Not with huge endowments, but really tuition-driven bottom lines, are very worried about enrollment and retention right now. I'm sure that's not news for anybody on this call. But at the same time, and maybe even as a tool towards enrollment, retention, persistence, et cetera, is the dominant narrative about how to make our institutions more equitable and inclusive, to make them inclusive learning environments. And I think some of us are doing a much better job than others. but finding a way to infuse equity and inclusion in all of our work, including assessment. And we're all here, I think we all agree, right? But is a very good tool when it comes to student retention, right? When students feel they belong, that they're included, that they're represented, and that they have equitable access to education, they're going to stay and graduate, right? And just in general, empowering students. These are all things we're being called to do right now. So I forgot to mention before, I have a few slides with these strikeout kind of things, and that's for me to illustrate where I've moved away from. So all of that has stayed the same, right? But I think what I really want my study to do, and I'm going to shift to the next slide, is explore how students, faculty, and staff who are engaged in student partnership work experience and conceptualize this work, and how they feel that that work might contribute to a student's sense of belonging. So, you know, and I'll kind of dig in a little bit more in a bit. So, like I mentioned, my theoretical framework is really built on this foundation of students as partners. This is an international framework, which is why I'm so excited to be able to attend this conference, because we've got to hear from a lot of folks around the globe about their work in this area. But they are, again, partnerships, right? So not one student representative on your board, but really, you know, equal participation, even though we're knowing it's going to be in different ways, right? And obviously, this is a radical cultural shift from anything that, at least in American higher education, we've really been exposed to, right? You know, instead, again, of this neoliberal approach of students being customers that receive the service of higher education, we're actually bringing them into the fold, making them a part of their own experience. Giving them agency is something we talk a lot about in this theoretical framework. So the literature, and there's a lot out there, and like I said, most of it is outside the United States, which I'm really excited to dig deeper as a part of my dissertation. So, and I've mentioned kind of a lot of these things, so I'll kind of move through this a bit quickly. But students as partners can work to challenge hierarchical structures, which really may be holding our institutions back when it comes to retention, persistence, graduation, right? So we're looking to see, are there different ways to do this? You know, is the rule of thumb that we are the providers and the masters and the keepers of this knowledge, or can we co-create knowledge with our students and honor their lived experiences, right? You know, we also talk a lot in this body of work about students as partners being a potential solution to disrupt neoliberalism that's kind of connected with that hierarchy. And then what I'm really interested in, and I haven't seen a whole lot in the literature, is students as partners being a way, a tool for student engagement and a strategy for enhancing student belonging. Meaning, if students are engaged in this work, where they're co-creating different elements of their higher education experience, would that make them feel like they belong? Would that, and you know, in a sense, impact retention and graduation, but really getting in at those tenets of student belonging? And I'll show you what that'll look like in my data analysis in a bit. So I have to create a project, right? Some kind of existing initiative that I can apply this theory to. So I originally wanted to explore a very large scale project. My institution, although we mean very well, we lack a formal inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. We call it IDEA at my institution. We don't have a very formalized program, right, where people can take training and earn badges and things like that. But the reason why I've crossed all of this out is our IDEA Council has actually been able to get some grant funding for this. So we actually recently got a badging and micro-credentialing system, and we're going to be making significant investments in this area. So I decided that might not be the best source or best project to work on with students, because we're funding it with grant money and will likely bring professional consultants. And this is a little bit more on the, I don't know, like something that everybody at my institution is talking about right now, meaning maybe this project isn't the best, nor is it the most focused to be scalable enough for a dissertation. So my newer idea now is, instead of kind of this broad creation of curriculum for idea topics, to really laser focus in on a problem on our campus related to assessment, because that is kind of my locus of control as well, right? Being the director of assessment and accreditation. So I'm not sure if this is a struggle that others on this call have, but we struggle significantly with the evaluation of our general education curriculum. I know for schools in my area, or schools in the SAC-COC region, we've been tasked about making this more of a priority. It's its own standard now in our principles of accreditation. And so if there is something wrong with it, it's much more visible now. And so we have established a program that I'm very proud of, but especially in any kind of assessment program or cycle's infancy, there's some stuff that's wrong with it, right? So something that that I would love to bring students in partnership with is looking at the rubrics that exist for our student learning outcomes and really getting students to help us simplify them. I think it's very empowering, and something I think that folks who engage in this kind of alternative assessment work all believe, is that students should be allowed to know exactly what success looks like for an assignment, to be able to look at a rubric and understand it quickly, to be able to understand it, etc. I will argue that most faculty that look at our gen ed rubrics don't understand them. They're very hard to norm, they're very complicated. And so this is the project I want to bring students in on. Maybe picking a few that need the most work and getting that student partnership and engagement around that, right? Having students help to co-create what they're going to take from their general education at Our Lady of the Lake University. I think that's huge, right? Students have the right to be able to influence that. And so as my assessment friends on this call, you see 8 student learning outcomes for gen ed. That's the first red flag, and that's as tidy as I could get it at this point. I agree there should be less, but this is what we're working with. So we have a rubric for each of these areas. Like I said, I don't think my project would look at editing all 8 of them down. I might get some faculty feedback on which ones they would prefer to work with students on. So step 1 would be, again, creating this project. So I think 6 to 8 weeks, having a weekly session. I'm very interested in obtaining grant funding so I can pay students and maybe even offer a stipend to faculty and staff to participate. I think that's important, that when we bring students in as partners, that we recognize that work is labor and that students deserve to get paid for their work with us, right? And so what I would do is collect regular reflections of the folks engaged in the partnership work, and also go into these sessions, not as the facilitator. So that's part of what my grant would fund too, is getting a facilitator to come and be a true third party to everybody involved. So I would not be the facilitator. What I would do though is observe the partnership dynamics during the work sessions, take field notes, etc. Then step 2 would be, once that project closes, conduct in-depth interviews with the folks that participated. So again, that looks like the whole kit and caboodle, consent procedures, recording, transcribing, and analyzing the data. So a few notes about how I plan to approach this is, I'll look at the different artifacts that I've collected over the course of the project. So those memos, reflections that I'll be obtaining from folks, the field notes that I took while I was observing, and then those transcripts, and then engage in some deductive coding. So looking at these key tenets for both of those foundational topics, students as partners and student belonging, and coding for themes within those, right? So those themes might look like, or those things I would code for students as partners might look at things like agency, empowerment, reciprocity, or shared responsibility. From the literature, those are key tenets and just examples. I could fix this a little bit or change it. And then with student belonging, key tenets based on the literature look like connectedness, membership, mattering, respect, and understanding. So we can see overlap there, but honestly, the relationship between students as partners approaches and student belonging, there's a lot of work to be done in this area, especially in the US. So I'm excited to fill that gap. I also just wanted to close, getting close to the end, and then we can do some discussion. I would love your feedback or any questions you have. But at the Assessment Institute, these are some of my heroes on the screen. Like I mentioned, I got to meet folks that I had been reading and citing for a really long time. And I also got to buy this book. And so I wanted to put it on your radar if you're interested in this work. During the pandemic, a bunch of my colleagues got together and wrote chapters for this book, all about reframing assessment to be a tool for equity, which is really at the foundation of what I want to do, what I want to contribute to the literature. And these are some of my references. But that's it for me. Like I said, I'm very open to feedback, and just would love to hear from you, any of your thoughts or questions. But thank you so much for sticking around for the last session. Bring your faces back up. Get the chat up too. Cool. There's chats that I definitely, yeah. For those of you who have presented or heard presenters say this, now I understand what they mean. When you're presenting, you don't see the chat function. Okay, so really just one comment. Thank you, Lisa. Awesome. Any feedback, any questions? I'm glad to give you all a few extra minutes too before we close it out, but I would love to hear from you if you have anything for me.
Yeah, Maddie, I think it'll take longer than 5 minutes.
Okay.
But yeah, just to say, at York here in Toronto, we've been, we just engaged a group of students in helping us design some students as partners programming in our office. I work in the Teaching Commons, so our teaching and learning center. Awesome. And I just sent a note to the students as you were talking, because the intersection of belonging is new to us. Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about the power dynamics as we understand them, but particularly as the students understand them. And these students have a very keen interest in equity as a way to underlie a lot of the work that we're doing. So there's a lot here, but just to say too, I think the piece around belonging also makes me think about research around persistence and retention too, which you've probably already been looking at. But I love that continuum of opportunities for belonging and working in partnership may positively impact retention and persistence. I have a student affairs and services background, so like Tinto is in my head and all of that good stuff. So there's not that Tinto is of course the be all and end all. I really appreciate the way you framed the research too. But yeah, I think there's a really lovely continuum and a really lovely thread that you're following there. So putting this into the bigger picture of learning, as well as the bigger concentric circle of, students and community and belonging and all that good stuff. So there's lots there, and maybe at some point we'll be able to do a little knowledge exchange or information exchange. We've been starting from theory first as well, but we're digging into, these students are on placement with us. And their goal is to help us design a program that features some of the things you talked about. And yeah, I love Gavin Henning too. He was the external on my my dissertation committee. So
Oh,
big fan of Gavin.
wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think Jankowski, I think she's gonna serve on mine. She,
Nice.
yeah, offered it at the end of the session, and so I need to follow up, but yeah, I'm
Awesome.
excited. Thank you.
Thank
Rob,
you.
your hand up. What do you have for me, Rob?
Greetings. Yeah, I like your talk. Yeah, so some of your stuff looked familiar. Oh, by the way, I'm at Binghamton, New York. I'm a postdoc, so don't let all this gray hair fool you. So the education literature is still somewhat new to me, but I did recognize some stuff. So I'm in the Department of Biological Sciences working with, we've got essentially a first year research immersion here, and we're also from a grant trying to promote these kind of undergraduate research experiences, both here at Binghamton and across SUNY. But some of your vocabulary kind of reminded me of some of the stuff that, especially when it comes to, students, ownership and retention, have you considered and so it doesn't have to be about science, but, the kind of a civically engaged projects where students pick their own kind of projects, they're invested in their community, or maybe they bring something from their own community into it. They work together in partnerships with each other and with the community. And then the kind of, certainly structure specific outcomes to kind of measure their learning. But they also can kind of identify along with that. But is that something that has jumped out at you, or like Sensor? I don't know if you're familiar with Sensor at all, where they do a lot of civically engaged projects, often around STEM, but Eliza Riley is the director of Sensor, and actually her second in command is over in Austin. I think she's in Austin. She was formerly at the New School in New York City, but a lot of these kind of student-driven projects, collaborating, that can run either from a semester or multiple semesters, but then also can integrate some of those accreditation questions in there to help keep those folks, as you've seen how important that stuff is.
Yeah.
But anyways, I just was curious because some of the vocabulary you're talking about, I've seen, and just wondering if that's something that's kind of popped into on your radar.
Yeah, funny enough, and I know we only have about 30 seconds left, but at my institution, we've got a lot going on in that regard. Like, we have a center for student learning and volunteerism, and so we have a lot of engaged learning going on. Our QEP, our quality enhancement plan, which is a SAC-COC requirement that we kind of follow up on every 5 years, is centered on e-portfolios using civic engagement projects as kind of the project they're working on. So a lot's going on elsewhere, but yes, great points. And